Hello and welcome to today's webinar from Missio Nexus. I'm Heather Pubels, the editor of Evangelical Missions Quarterly and the founder of Le Motif, a communications consulting firm and Missio Nexus member organization. Jessica Whitmore will be presenting our webinar today entitled Discovering the Effective Writer Within You. Let me introduce our presenter. Jessica Whitmore has been more than 20 years involved as a writer. She also teaches writing at the college level. You can read more about her on the website. Jessica, I was wondering if you could tell us about one of your current writing projects.
Sure. So I have a range of clients. I work with nonprofits with grant writing. I work with marketing companies on content. And one of the things I do most frequently is actually, I'm a ghostwriter. So I write content that goes under somebody else's byline, and I consider myself like a movie stunt double. If I'm doing my job right, nobody knows that I've written it. So that's kind of fun and exciting to see that out there.
I like it that you've called it the writer stunt double.
Yes.
Really great. Well, for everyone else, please remember to put your questions in the chat panel as you think of them. We're going to get to as many as we can, some during the presentation, and the rest we'll get to at the very end. Jessica, it's great to have you here with us today, and welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my content so you guys can get, all right, here we go. So we all want to be effective writers. The first thing is, we all kind of know this already, but words have power. They can change people, inspire people, encourage ideas. If you think the stories that you within your organizations have, you know that you can already do these things. It's just finding the words that work best to share that information. So let's focus on writing well, because honestly, everybody can write, whether you're a third grader, an experienced communicator, or somebody who just likes to write. You can write. The hard work of it is writing well. So you need to first start about what helps you write. And one of the things that I go to is, what do I have to have? Is it silence? Is it music? Do I need snacks? Do I need something to drink? Last week, my nails were too long and it was driving me crazy. I needed my nails to be shorter at that moment. So you need to think of what helps you write. And then if we have any procrastinators, you can use your procrastination to your benefit. And that comes into play because within the communication industry, we work on deadlines. A lot goes on behind the scenes involving a lot of team members. So if you're writing a piece, it's not just you. You're working with sources, and that could be internet sources. It could be sources you actually call an interview. You're working with editors. You can have multiple editors involved. They are working with graphic designers. Sometimes if you're working for a large publication, there could be legal teams involved for legal reviews, marketing teams, PR teams. All these different people have their hands in the content that needs to go out. And so the deadlines that are set are important to maintain, because the next thing has to happen for it to move forward to publication. So one of my favorite things to say is, the deadline rules you, or you rule the deadline. And that comes into play with a lot of backtracking your deadlines. If you know when something is due, move backwards on it. Don't wait till the last minute. And if you are going to procrastinate, just make sure that you're using that to your benefit. I'll talk about that a little bit because that ties into perfectionism as well. One of my favorite quotes that I remind myself often: poor planning on your part does not necessitate an emergency on mine. Whether it's my own planning, or if I'm working with a colleague or a source or something like that. So planning is really, really important within your writing for the deadlines. You always want to plan with more time than you think is necessary. Crazy things can happen. Your internet can crash. Your computer can die. Your source that you thought was going to be the most amazing person decides they don't want to talk to you. A source you've been talking to all of a sudden is in the hospital. All these little things can cause issues with meeting that deadline and getting your writing out there. So as much time as you think you're going to have for planning, you also need to put some buffers in there as well. So I consider myself a recovering perfectionist. And if we have some perfectionists out there, I'd ask you to raise your hands, but I can't see you. We can't be perfect in our writing. We can aim for the best that we can be, but we're not going to be perfect. That is why every writer needs an editor and every editor needs a writer. We need each other in that relationship. Even though I've written for 20 some years across a variety of platforms, I'm going to miss something. I'm still going to send something over where it's there instead of there. Or I'm using an incorrect form of a verb. I've done the best I can do, and then I have to hand it off to my editor. And then the editor's role is to clean it up as well. Obviously, the cleaner copy you can give, the better within that, but don't stress yourself out to be perfect. Writing can often be very, we bare our souls sometimes in that writing, so we can become very protective of our writing, but we still have to send it out there. The story still has to be sent out to be told. And sometimes our perfectionism can hinder that as we work towards the deadlines and as we work as a team member throughout all of it. So your editors, and I say editors, it can also mean supervisors. They can be your friend or they can be your foe. I choose to look at my editors as a friend. We both want high quality work. They may challenge me, I may challenge them. But again, our goal is to get out the best story that we can tell in a written format. And the same thing if you're working internally in a communication department, your supervisor and you should be working together to get quality content out. Especially in the faith-based arena, we should be giving our best work, not just throwing it together and throwing it out there. I'm not talking about toxic work environments here at all. That's a whole different situation. But when it comes to working and collaborating together, that editor is really important in the process. We, as communication professionals and editors, we work with style guides. And these can be long documents, they can be short documents. And what they basically do for a publication or for like a nonprofit or an organization, it will let any writer know and any editor know what the style is. What are you capitalizing? Which commas are you using? Are you using the Oxford comma? Or are you not using the Oxford comma? Are you putting periods after abbreviations for titles or degrees? You know, is it PhD or PH period D period within that? The style guides get down to the very basic information of how things are written and put together. If you're in an organization that does not have an internal style guide and you're in that communication part or you're handling marketing, PR, kind of all ties together sometimes, I highly recommend you work on creating one. You probably have more of a style in place than you even realize. Those things where, oh, by the way, we do it this way, or we only abbreviate our organization in this capacity within that. It's a great project for interns to start to document that internal style guide. There's also external style guides. The one I work with the most frequently is the AP Style Book. They determined across the country and the nation how publications in print should use certain words and terms, spellings, punctuation. They do not use the Oxford comma. So if I have anybody who absolutely loves the Oxford comma, I know you'll be disappointed with that. The AP style book, you can find their resource online. It has a subscription base. There are books printed every 2 years. I think the 2022 edition is the next one that's coming out. They also have a really great social media presence. So if there's something that's happening in the world and your organization is writing an article about it and you're not quite sure how to identify what is happening, usually if it's a hot topic, the AP style book social media will highlight it in some way. So like when COVID started happening, it was, you should reference it this way, or there's different international things happening, they'll say, reference it this way. It keeps a standard across the board that we all try to follow. Different organizations have different style guides. So if you are asked by a publication to write an article, ask them to see a copy of their style guide. It is not an internal secret thing at all. They're probably going to be very thankful that you ask for it. It does not mean you have to memorize it. The AP style book is very thick. Copy editors know it, but as long as you know what your topic is and kind of around that area. You don't want your editors or your supervisors to be surprised. So if you're running into issues with sources or meeting your deadline or anything like that, you don't want them to be surprised. There's a ripple effect that goes on if something is delayed. And so for myself, I work with a multitude of editors with different clients, and I'll just give them updates. Hey, I had a great interview with so-and-so. It's really coming together. Or, hey, just wanted to let you know, my kids are sick. I'm working on this as best as I can, but there might be a little bit of a delay. Sometimes you might feel like you're over communicating some of that, but it's always better. Let them know what's going on. They have to report it up the chain as they meet with their people on their publications, and you just don't want to surprise them in the process. There's a great textbook that I use with one of my college classes, Writing for the Mass Media. It's in the 9th edition. You can find it in print on Amazon. The publisher is Pearson. They have online versions of it as well. And within that book, he talks about how writers in the communication field are really the caretaker of the language. We kind of protect what is expected for that language. And that comes down to the basics of sentences, nouns and verbs, paragraphs, transitions, your grammar. I know some of you are probably cringing. I'll get to some tips on that in a second. So you're the caretaker of the language. I'm going to go over sentences and nouns and verbs in a second, but paragraphs in communication style of writing, whether you're writing online, blogs, social media, long form articles for publication, we're writing with shorter paragraphs. If you think of when you're reading in a blog online, too many words all condensed together makes our eyes overwhelmed. And so we're going to shut down. So you're doing shorter paragraphs, which are about 3 to 5 sentences is around where I aim for. Obviously, if you're working with an editor, you're going to ask that question as well sometimes. You can ask them any of these questions as you work to write, because the format is a little different. We're not writing academically. We're not writing like an essay or a book within it. We're using transitions, again, grammar and punctuation. I see a lot of issues overall with commas. Comma placements can be really hard. So it's making sure you don't have run-on sentences where you should have a comma, or comma splices where you don't, where you're putting in extra commas that don't belong there. And then again, the lovely Oxford comma, depending on what the style guide the organization or the publication is following. And for those of you cringing with grammar, you can hang in there. I have something to help you. So don't ever let any of this keep you from sharing your stories. There's ways to get around it. All right. There we go. So nouns and verbs, you want to make sure that they're in agreement. And I know this seems like a lot. I'm going to go through as we get a little bit further, kind of my process when it comes to writing and editing. So hopefully you're not, I don't want you to feel overwhelmed at this moment, but make sure your verbs and your nouns are in the proper agreement within it. You want to keep your verb tenses the same throughout your piece. So you're not shifting back and forth between past tense and present tense. But if you're writing in past tense, it's all in past tense. If you're writing in present, you want it all in present tense. You're looking for more active verbs so that one, it makes the verb have more oomph, but also you're being very careful with your word count, which we'll talk about in a second as well. And then your verbs that you use in attributions, if you're writing stories that actually you're quoting your sources, there's a proper attribution structure to use with that. I did not include that in here. If anybody's interested in it, you're more than welcome at the end to email me and I can get that to you. Sometimes the structure also is dependent on the publication. So that's another question that you can ask, or if you have the actual publication, you can start to look at the articles and see what their structure looks like as well. So our sentences, just like our paragraphs are going to be shorter, our sentences are going to be shorter. This isn't, when you're writing for communication-based stuff, marketing, PR, publications, blogs, social media, it is not the time to have these huge 3-part sentences that are all tied in with amazing conjunctions and punctuation. You're really keeping it simple and you're keeping it clear, because as a reader, if you're reading, again, a blog or a magazine article in print, you want something that's easy to read. You don't want to be stumbling over things yourself. So in the marketing world, there's a great acronym called KISS, which is Keep It Simple, Stupid, which sometimes I refer to it as Keep It Simple, Silly. You just want to go basic. It's not a time to feel like you have to go over the top. So one of the ways you can do this is think of big words. We all like to use big words because they make us sound impressive. And we've always been told to have great vocabulary. Use smaller words instead. So if I'm continually using utilize, just break it down to use. So it's just something to think about as you're writing. What big words are you using that you can use a smaller one just to keep it simple and keep it clear? So you're varying your type and your length of your sentences. You can have some short ones, long ones. You can put 2 of them together with a proper punctuation and conjunction. But you just want to keep it varied within that. You don't want it to become a monotone 5-word sentence all the way through. Because you're really, with writing, you're creating a rhythm. So I'm not a fan of poetry, but I love the rhythm of poetry. And the same thing can happen in any type of writing that you're doing in communication. You can create a rhythm. And then you're using your transitions to tie sentences together. Does not mean every sentence needs a transition, but you should sprinkle them in there. Kind of like if you get ice cream and you're getting sprinkles on them, or Jimmy's, you're just going to sprinkle the transitions in there between your sentences, between your paragraphs, just to see how it flows. Another way to think of it sometimes is that what you're writing in your sentences and paragraphs almost becomes like a river. So you want that reader, whoever that is, to flow down the river with you as you're guiding them, as the water is kind of guiding them down the river. So are your words. You're kind of guiding them through there and you're making it easy for them to read. All of this comes down to knowing who your audience is. So every organization, every publication, they all have different audiences that are the target audience within it. So it's important to know who that audience is. Sometimes the editor will say, I want you to work on this piece and our target audience for this blog piece going out is X, Y, and Z. Or if you're working for an organization, you might say, well, we're writing a donor appeal and we need it to go to donors, not to who we are providing services for. So a couple of great ways that you can determine this. If you're reading a publication and there's ads in it, you can start to pick up on who are they advertising to for their audience. If it is a magazine focusing on teenagers, there's going to be different ads than if it's a magazine for an elderly couple who is now starting retirement. Same thing with television. You can start to pick up on who the target audience is based on the ads. Your editors will know. Great question to ask is, okay, who's our audience for this? Who are we trying to reach? And the other thing you can do, this is great if you're working in an organization, you can create and even name a marketing persona. So I had a colleague I know works in healthcare, and they had determined that the female head of the house is the one who makes the most healthcare decisions for the family. And they found out all the demographic information that they could about what this person would look like, and what their attributes were, all on demographic-based information. And they decided to name what they had pulled all together as Sue. So when they would be in meetings in their departments, they'd be like, well, we need an article for X, Y, and Z. What do you think Sue would think of this? And it helps in that way, because then you're realizing you're not just writing to the broad market. You have a specific person in mind that you are thinking of as you're putting things together. So for myself, because I write for a variety of clients, I write some pharmaceutical stuff. Sometimes I write educational stuff. I have to switch in my mind. Who is my audience? Who am I writing for? Because obviously that niche audience is going to determine what you're using. So I've written for credit union executives. I've also written in fitness magazines, completely different audiences. It's going to determine if I'm using use or if I'm using utilize. It's going to determine what information they already know, and what I need to inform them on. If you're writing for the larger audience, the average reading level is about 6th to 9th grade. I've heard 6th to 8th, I've heard 9th, kind of in there. So that's why when we go back to being simple in our word choices and our sentence structures, we're really bringing it down for that larger audience. And sometimes what I have to do is think, okay, how would I call my mom and tell my mom about this? Or when I was little, if I wanted to call my grandparents, how would I explain this to them? So if you think in this essence of whoever you would call with the news, like if you weren't writing this piece, but you were sharing it, how would you let them know? How would you tell them? And it doesn't mean your writing has to be that informal, but it just kind of helps balance it out a little bit as well. Jargon and cliches. In faith-based organizations, we have a lot of these. If you can think of the words and the phrases that you use that are well known, that an outsider would look at you and go, I have no idea what you're talking about. So be careful when you write about these. Again, it goes back to knowing your audience, and being careful so that you're not confusing. You're not throwing in words or phrases that are unknown to them. So it becomes one of, if it is unknown, are you going to explain it? Are you going to put in a little sidebar? I've seen articles with sidebars of definitions before. Are you going to, in your writing, explain what it is? I am not a big fan of parentheses in writing. If I have to use a parentheses, that means that I really need to share what I'm trying to convey. And often at that point, it becomes more about writing it as a separate sentence or using a phrase that's in there. You can also think, do I really need to include this? Is it something that it's not important to be in there? And I can just avoid using that cliche or that jargon. And then if you think back to familiar words to your audience and what you're writing about, because you don't want to slow down the reader. You don't want them to be confused and leave your blog, or not finish the article and figure out, they missed the important part of how you hope that they will give to your organization, or they'll help support something. On the flip side, you don't want to insult your reader. So if your audience should know it and you're going into in-depth explanation, they may think, well, why are they explaining? I already know that. So it's a fine balance that really goes back to knowing who your audience is again, and just keeping them in mind throughout it. As a writer, you don't want to be confused. If you have been approached by an editor to write for a publication, they obviously know that you're a subject matter expert or a SME on something. So you probably know your subject very well. If they've asked you to do a story or a piece that involves interviews, then you're going to have to research your subject and research the person that you're interviewing. I love LinkedIn for this reason. All of my, most of my stories that I write are very soft news based for publications, and I'll get into that in a second. So the connections I make with my sources, I can continue on. It's not like I'm covering local meetings, although I have local meetings where I don't want to stay connected to the random person on the street I've asked a question about. But if it's somebody that I can connect with further and develop a rapport, because if they're a great source, you're going to go back to them. They're going to become your subject matter expert on whatever content it is. I love LinkedIn for this reason, to connect to people, because I can see their bio. I can find out what they've done. I do a lot of stories on people, so I can kind of dig into who they are. Google or any of your other search platforms are great for researching a person, researching a subject, to make sure that you know what you're writing about. Because if you're confused, your writing's going to be confused, and then your reader's going to be confused. And then you don't accomplish your goal that you set out to do. It does not mean that you have to be an expert in what you're writing about. Years ago, I had to write a piece on concrete for a trade publication. And there's not much that I really know about concrete, or at that time, what I really cared to know about concrete. But I had to research it and understand it myself so that I could present it in the writing. So just make sure you're including research time in there as well, or reaching out to people who know the subject. You don't have to know it all yourself. All right, you want to be efficient. So within the communication industry, we work with word counts. We don't work with 1 to 2 page papers or anything like that. Everything's usually word count based. It has to do with the old days of newspapers and how much space. You might have heard column space as well. The word space is determined usually by the editor, or if you're working internally, it's determined by your supervisor or what you're working on within that. The word counts are important because the editors have plotted out, if you're working for a magazine publication, they've plotted out their storyboard. They know exactly what they're covering, how long they need each piece. So if you're working on one piece, they also probably have a whole bunch of other writers working on other pieces. And if everybody went over their word counts, it'd be way too much. And if everybody went way under their word counts, you'd not have a magazine. So you really want to be aware. Usually they come in ranges. A typical blog length right now is around 400 words. That's the minimum you want to be able to populate well in searches. As you get further along in publications, it goes up longer and higher. Same with ebooks if you're writing those. So I've written everything from 400 word blog pieces to 3,000 word articles to 6,000 word ebooks within it. So the thing to remember is every word matters, and you don't want to waste time. You don't want to waste words within it. If you're running into issues, that's where you go back to your editor and you say, hey, look, I have so much information that I know you wanted 800 words, but I have 4,000 words in notes. And that really happened to me on a story I was working on. It had to do with something related to COVID, and we let a lot of people have their voices all in, and we ended up with 4,000 words. Actually, as it was edited down, and the editor and I decided to do a series on it. I've gone back sometimes to editors and said, I know you had me working on this story, but within that story, I also learned there's this possible story. Do you want them tied into one? Do you want them 2 separate stories? In that case, we went 2 separate stories. You can also incorporate sidebars. graphs, different things like that. Online with blogs, you have so many options with hyperlinks to hyperlink to information to save your own words within it. So it's just keeping an eye on that word count. The word count don't be so concerned about it on your first draft, but as you're tightening things together, you want to be aware of that as well. You want to be objective. You're sharing a story. A lot of the personal aspects of that can come through in your quotes or in the information that you share, but not from you as the writer, unless you're writing a piece like that and you're not showing off. And that goes back to knowing who your audience is. Again, what words you're using, what phrases, what jargon, what sentence structure within all of that. So your editor or your supervisor obviously knows you're a good writer if they've asked you to write something. So you don't have to worry about showing off, just write the content. On the flip side, if you're trying to write more, just keep on writing with what you have available to you or what you're able to come up with for ideas on your own. So some of my favorite tips for cutting word counts, the word vary. So what I usually do in an editing round, and I'll get to that in a second as well, is I'll go through and I'll see what word am I using way too much in here. And there's sometimes I'll be like, oh, I use that 5 times in one paragraph. That's way too many times. So look for those types of words, which also can include very. If somebody was very hungry versus hungry, they're still hungry. Pregnant versus very pregnant, they're still pregnant. So you can cut out very, saves a great word count. Same thing with the word like. This is a personal quirk of mine. Don't start a sentence with there. So we often see it with there are or there is. It becomes a false noun. You can typically flip your wording around in your sentence to make it stronger and to make it more concise. So the example I have on the screen, there are 50 chairs in this room. All you have to say is this room has 50 chairs. You have just cut out a handful of words. And cutting 3 words here, 4 words there may not seem like a big deal, but when you need to cut 200 words and you're starting to narrow them down bit by bit, they all start to add up. You also want to cut out unnecessary that. So we usually use that way too much. Sometimes it is needed in the sentence. So what I will do is if I'm reviewing what I wrote and I see a that, I will try to read the sentence without it in there. If the sentence makes sense without it in there, you can cut it out. You don't need it. It just becomes an extra word that you can use somewhere else. So very like there are, there is, and that. Those are the top ones for me to watch for. Integrity. Please do not plagiarize in any of your stories. Do not create facts and don't create quotes. It still happens in mainstream journalism. There's a multitude of stories that are out there. I'm sure it happens at smaller scales as well, where it might not be getting as much press, but just be aware of these things. The only disclaimer I'll put that on not creating quotes is if you're working on a PR piece internally and somebody has given you authority to speak on their behalf, then that would be where you're okay creating the quote. But if you're writing a piece and you're short a source, so typically you look for about 2 sources an article. Sometimes everybody thinks they want a voice in the article. I've had it happen where I've had multiple people want to be mentioned in an article. I will tell them it depends, because again, you're working on word count, you're working on a deadline, you're working on parameters set by the editor. So we also don't promise anybody that they're going to appear in a story. You never know if you need to cut them out or if your editor needs to cut them out. So we just don't make promises like that either. And as a faith-based organization, it's really important to to hold on to that integrity. So the way I write, and everybody comes up with their own styles to help. So you already know what you need to write well. I have my snacks, I have my quiet. My nails are at a good length where they're not driving me crazy. And I'm gonna start to write. So that can be based on either somebody has given you an assignment, whether it's an editor, a supervisor, somebody like that, or on the other side of it, you can pitch an idea. And that is basically where you're in just a few sentences saying, I had this idea about a story about X, Y, and Z. What do you think? You think I could write on that? They don't have to be lengthy because sometimes it's just the idea that needs to be presented out there, either for yourself or to kind of get other ideas in place. Then you're gonna take your time to research, interview, whatever that process needs to be to gather your information. And then you're just gonna write. So the picture there is coffee being spilt over. You're gonna let your words spill over. I've heard it called a brain dump. Usually if I interview somebody, I'm typing up their notes into my computer. So it's all there so I can see it completely. You're just putting whatever words you need to write to get them out of your brain. It is completely ugly. I had a client once asked me if they could see my first draft, and I said, no. You have paid me for the final piece, not for my first draft. I would be embarrassed if anybody saw my first draft. Second drafts can be even worse because it's just all a mess, right? You've just put all your words out there. You've kind of thrown up everything that you want to write out, because the real beauty of it, what really makes it pretty, is the editing. And editing is the key to writing well. And I know a lot of people sigh and they think, oh, I don't want to write. I mean, I don't want to edit. I just don't want to do that. It is still an important spot within the process, especially if you're working with an editor. So I have edit written on there 4 times. I usually go through my pieces 3 or 4 times. Does not mean I'm spending hours on it. I'm using multiple rounds. The first time I might be looking for what words can I make shorter? What words am I overusing? I might go through it another read through and look for my verbs. So I keep my verbs consistent. Am I shifting? If I have quotes in there, I'm going to go through and I'm specifically going to look at my attribution structure. Do I have it in there correctly? Am I identifying people correctly? Am I considering any internal style guides that I need to keep in mind while I'm going through this? So that's why I'm going through it multiple times, but they're quick. I'm just looking through for specific things. You can also have a friend, a family member, a colleague review what you've written if you have time for that. At some point, hopefully you'll be confident enough to know, like, okay, this is okay. I've written well, but it's really helpful, especially at the beginning, to just have somebody else glance over it. And ideally, when you've created your timeline for your deadlines, you're creating a buffer in there to give yourself a break as well. Ideally, it's 24 hours. Sometimes that turns to 3 hours, depending on what you're balancing and everything like that. But what you're basically doing, you have it written, you've had it edited, you've gone through multiple rounds. You think you're ready to send it, but you know what? I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to go read a book. I'm going to go take care of something else. I'm going to go exercise. I'm going to take care of some other responsibility on my plate. And what you're basically doing is you're separating your brain from what you wrote. Because when you go back after 24 hours and give another read through, you're going to pick up on things that your brain assumed were there. So this is where, when we have words that get through spell check, or what did I have the other day? I meant to type institution. And when I came back to look at it later, I had typed instruction. But my brain, when I read it through, had thought it was institution. So by taking that break, however long it hopefully can be for you, your brain is shifting away from it so that you're looking at it with fresh eyes in the process as well. 24 hours is ideal. This doesn't always happen. Another tip is you can read aloud. If you don't want to read around other people, I don't recommend whispering it. It doesn't have the same effect. So if you need to go to your car, or you need to go to a conference room, or go to a room that, in your house that nobody else is around, read through it aloud. Are there any awkward phrases that you're stumbling over? Are you confused by anything? Are you stumbling just in general as you're reading things? If that's happening while you're going through it aloud, that's also going to happen in the reader's mind. And so those are the parts to go back and to rework. There have been times where I've had sections that I just can't pull it together. I've tried. And so I'll actually make an editor's note, and I'll say, because I have good relationships with my editors that I've established, I'll say, this part just wasn't coming together for me. I appreciate any insight. Now, I don't fill the whole thing with that, but occasionally I might say something like that to my editor, or I might email them and be like, what, I'm really struggling with this phrase. What do you think? And that's where that friend or foe aspect and developing that relationship is really beneficial to you, because the editor, they want high quality work. We want the sources to be proud of what is coming out for them as well. So just be mindful of those different things that help. I just, again, don't recommend you whisper it, because whispering just doesn't have the same effect. What's really great is if you have a bunch of people writing, you can all put them in one room and everybody read it aloud, really, really loud. Nobody's paying attention to anybody else. But that's kind of a fun thing to do sometimes too. I make my college students do that. You're using any resources that are available to you. Again, the style guides, whether they're internal, the AP style book. Please use your spell check. So many of these things seem so automatic anymore. Your grammar check. If you really struggle with grammar, Grammarly.com is a great resource. It's like an add-on that you can just put onto your computer, and anything you type, whether it's an email, a document, it will automatically check it for you and give suggestions. I'm also, if I'm struggling with a word, one of my biggest issues with writing is effect and effect. I usually go to impact. You can take a word and stick it into your, Google or whatever else you use to search, and look, is the definition right? Am I using this the right way? If I'm not sure how to spell something and spell check isn't even picking up on it, sometimes I'll just dump it into Google and be like, what's coming up on this? And either I'll find it or I'll decide to use something else that makes more sense within it. Throughout the editing process, you have to be okay with scratching, changing, and rewriting parts. You also need to be okay if the editor is doing that. So I have, over the course of my career, I've had pieces that have been published word for word, which is always very exciting. I've had pieces that have appeared where the first third of the article is gone. I've had pieces appear where the paragraphs have been moved all over the place. Once I've sent it to the editor, it's at the editor's discretion, right? They're the ones that have to finish making it pretty. They know what else they're working with other stories and space and things like that. So you want to make sure you don't love your writing so much you can't allow it to be changed or to be cut by you or the editor. And this is where it's hard with word count sometimes, but one of the ways I look at it is if I'm working on a story and I'm way over word count and I have to cut out things and I feel like they're very special aspects, I, as a Christian myself, will often, as I'm cutting them out, I'll be like, you know what, this is God's little gift of insight to me, or this really applied to my life. I know I was gathering the information for a story, but in the interview, God really spoke to me about this. So you know what? It doesn't fit in the story. It fit into my life. And it's my own little personal devotion from God that has come through putting this story together. So that's how I look at it when I have to cut out like really amazing parts. They're just kind of ones that I get to know, which are kind of neat as well. You can also always, if you've developed that relationship with your editor and you want to know why they've changed something, you can ask them as well. That's what I love about maintaining a good relationship with an editor or a supervisor, if it's in that case as well. Courtesy reviews. I know everybody, all sources want to see what their story is going to be before it's out published in the world. In general, especially in newspaper or broadcast, that does not happen. Hard news, it does not happen. Soft news, if it's in a newspaper arena or anything like that, it's not going to happen. The sources see it when the general public sees it. For internal publications, publications that are external and like from organizations or become like another marketing part, sometimes they're under marketing. That has become more common for courtesy reviews where sources can review it. That is usually determined by the editor or by your supervisor if you're working internally. My first question when I take on a new client, and if there are interviews I'm doing with people, I will ask them, do you let your sources see the articles before they're published? And some will say yes, and some will say no. If you're a source being given the courtesy of reviewing a piece, your role is to review for facts and data, not to rewrite everything. Because again, as a source, you're not aware of what they're working with, word count or direction or anything like that. And again, I've had sources who have said, nope, everything looks good. I've had sources send it back with everything rewritten, where I just say, thank you for all your suggestions. I will discuss them with the editor within it. I don't, tell them, no, we can't change it all. But a good way to be a good source is just stick to the facts and the data that you've been asked to review. If you're sending out something for a review, I love using track changes. Make sure that's turned on and saved when you send it to them so that when you get it back, you can see what they wanted to change, and then you can accept it or decline it as well. You do not have to accept all their suggestions. It's kind of at the editor's discretion, the writer's discretion. And again, sometimes that goes where the writer, editor have a conversation. I knew one person one time that tried to change the whole headline and everything. So those are conversations beyond you as the writer, internally or outsourced to a publication. And one of the biggest things is make sure you develop a thick skin. Over the course of my career, I've heard everything from this is the most amazing writing you've ever done to this is the worst thing you've ever written. What were you thinking? I've had editors who have said that kindly. I have had editors who have been very mean within that. And that's where that friend or foe versus toxic environment you kind of have to be aware of as well. But the important thing is your words that you're putting out there are not a reflection of you. So if the editor's asking questions and they want to make changes and they need more information or they change things, it's not a reflection of you. They're doing their job to help make it even better. So sometimes I think of it as this way. I took the writing to this level, the editor's taking it to the next one. And then I often think, what can I learn from that? What, maybe I used too many commas. Maybe this worked really well. This interview style worked really well. That's why I got great quotes. So it's a matter of kind of looking at it and not taking it personal, even though writing is very personal and we're sharing our skills and our talents and artistic part of us. So it's kind of like if somebody has a painting they've done and somebody comes in and loves it and somebody else comes in and like, this is horrific. What were they thinking? It can be very personal to the painter. As writers, we can experience that as well. Two of my favorite things, one's a quote, one's a scripture that I wanted to include for you guys. No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader, no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader. Because most of my writing does focus on storytelling of people or businesses, nonprofits, I can really get to the heart of writing with feeling. And that usually comes through with quotes, or if I'm in an interview and I'm able to get somebody to disclose on their own something they're willing to share. It's okay to feel that as the writer. So I remember one story I was working on, this lady, her story was like so beautiful. And God really spoke to me through her story. And the best compliment I got from her was, "Your story made me cry. Thank you so much." And to me, like I've touched on an emotion, whether that emotion is to make somebody feel, to make them donate, something like that. It's not being manipulative. It's just sharing the story in a way that there's such a response within it. And then the other one, I read this recently and it hit me a little differently. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him or her who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. And when I read it in the context I was reading it, and I thought, that's exactly as writers, what we're doing. And we don't often think of ourselves that way sometimes, but it's important. It's an important part to realize within our lives. All right. And that is everything for today. So if you want to contact myself, my email's on there. Also the email for Heather as well. And all these slides will be coming through in the handouts to you. So
thank you, Jessica, very much for what you shared. I want to summarize a few things that I really liked. I liked when you were talking about reading aloud, taking a break, the importance of using an editor and having people review the things that you've written, and how important it is to have multiple rounds of edits and see yourself as a writer of taking your writing to one level and your editor taking it to the next. It's excellent. Very, very good. I also wanted to really give you kudos for having written a story about concrete. That's really amazing.
Yeah, that one was a challenge.
Anyone who has questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. I can ask those of Jessica now, but I have one to get us started. Jessica, tell me, what's one thing that you have in particular spent time improving in your writing yourself over the years?
I think the hardest thing that I've had to do is actually hit that send button at the end. Here, let me turn on my video so you guys can see me too. Is hitting the send. I can procrastinate, and I am a recovering perfectionist. So coming to that point of I've gone through and edited it 4 different times, and I have to trust myself, and I have to trust the editor, and I have to send it. So I used to ask my husband to read my stories, and he finally looked at me years ago and was like, why? Like, you know what you're doing, just get it out there. So I think that for me has been the hardest thing to come up with.
I like that. I sometimes take a deep breath before I hit send.
Yes.
Just say, it probably has mistakes in it, but that's okay. There's an editor that's going to look at it.
There's an editor.
That's right. Great. Somebody's written here, the story of concrete reminded me of a Gilmore Girls episode where Rory had to write a story about repaving the parking lot. Yeah.
See, yes.
Somebody has asked, Alex has asked, is writing longhand without a keyboard helpful to the writing process?
It really comes down to what helps you the best. So like my college students, there are things they have to submit in written, typed. But a lot of their work, if you prefer hand writing it, go for it. I write all my notes from interviews, long form, longhand, and then type them over. It's up to your preference. What helps you the best way to write what you want to write?
Sharon has asked, how and where do you find places to pitch articles?
Oh, this is so great. So there's a resource called the Writer's Guide. I know I have the 2019 edition. There's a 2020 edition. It changed publishers right when COVID was happening, and so I haven't tracked it down completely. That lists a bunch of publications across the United States, trade and like hobby publications. And there's email addresses in there. You can reach out to editors that way. If there's a publication you follow or a blog site and you want to start writing for them, just reach out to that editor. The first time I did this, when I started writing for a local newspaper, I had to beg 3 times for a chance. So sometimes it's kind of like looking for a job sometimes, and just being proactive in it. And if you already have a connection with an organization as a member or a publication, it's a good way just to reach out and say, hey, I have some thoughts to share. I'm really interested in this. So an organization I used to write for, I don't write for them as much because they went to more internal people that were willing to write within it. So you can reach out that way.
Right. Very good. Somebody has made a comment, writing with non-native English speakers in mind is a good discipline for avoiding unneeded cliches and idioms.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really good. I have another question here. What's one of the most common writing problems that you see?
Commas. They're so hard and difficult. But if you Grammarly within it, resources like that, if you're in an organization that offers like the college that I work at, they offer a writing center for the students. If you have things like that, a lot of communicators think, I can't go ask for help because I'm a communicator, I'm supposed to know how to write. Well, yes and no. Use those resources that are available to you. The other thing I see is a lot of, if somebody's writing a story and you've interviewed people, they might say, well, I sat down and interviewed, or when I asked, and you don't have to put that in there. You don't have to preface it. 1, you're taking up words, and 2, unless you're asked for a first person writing, you want to remove yourself. You don't even want them to know that you're there. So those are the 2 things that I see most often.
That's great. Abigail is asking, what is the best length or best word count for a newsletter?
Oh, that I don't know. I don't do as much with newsletters. I would think, one, is it email or printed? Did she say?
That's a great question. No, she didn't specify.
Email. Okay. I would be mindful of what your pictures are in there, and also what you're scrolling, how long you have to have them scroll down. And how long are your paragraphs, or are you going to have them open up to separate blog pieces? There's some organizations that will post up blogs just to get in Google searches. Mm-hmm. If it's too long for your email newsletter, just put up a blog post and then put your hyperlink over to that within it.
That's great. That's great. Sue is asking, is there an online editing program you recommended? You mentioned Grammarly. What about Hemingway or another one?
I have not used those, so I am not sure. I'm sorry. I'll have to look that one up.
Let me dovetail with this. Are there tools that you would recommend that people use for their writing? Maybe ones that you haven't mentioned already, but maybe what's one of your favorite tools?
So I have a lot of book resources. Some of them, I don't have the exact titles. There's a book resource that tells you if words should be 1 word or 2 words. If words should be hyphenated within it. So if you find resources that are helping you in that way, look for a book or something. I don't reference them often, but they are very helpful to have.
Great. Anyone else have any questions? Let's see. Any suggestions for, okay, this is Gail. When you are writing content that is specifically challenging very commonly held perceptions about an issue and your editor doesn't seem to get it and makes changes that unintentionally undermines the change you're advocating for, how do you handle that situation?
Yeah. One, is it the best place for your piece to be, right? Is it the best place? There's a book called, I can't think of the name of it. It has to do with writing on social issues. if you're not finding the source or publication of where you can share exactly what you want to share, just create your own blogs, your own website, your organization's website. Start putting up thought leadership articles. Use your social media feeds to share your insight as an organizational voice. It doesn't mean take that same article because you've given it to that publication. You can't rerun it. But look to other ways that you can do that as well. And you can have a conversation with that editor, and then you can determine, is this a good fit or is this not a good fit? And as a freelance writer, I've changed where those fits work.
I like that. So your focus is on alignment, not trying to get them to change their opinion because they might not.
Right.
Very good. Very good. Matt Gibbons is asking, what are the best 1 or 2 books on writing that you've read that have most impacted how you write or think about writing and communication?
I do I know it's a textbook, writing for is if you write, let me look it up really quick. Is there a way, Heather, I can send you some of these to send out? Probably not afterwards.
We might be able to put some in the description with the recording.
I have a pile of them downstairs that go into more in-depth storytelling that are really instrumental and really good. A lot of them that I use are actually out of print stories, but they're very helpful. So if you can get your hands on some of those, I can't remember them off the top of my head, but I can get the list to you. Or if you want to email me, anybody can email me and ask me specifically for that list.
Great. That sounds good. Alan has asked, are there any websites, social media pages you would recommend as examples of best practice for well-written articles, social media posts, and blogs?
So what I tend to do, if I'm writing for a publication, I'm following their website. If I'm a nonprofit, I'm following other nonprofits. Sometimes if you're looking to larger organizations, like I think it's Nike does really well with their social media, start following them. Social media rules are always changing with what is and isn't. It's such an evolving part of the field within it, but just start to pay attention to what publications you enjoy reading and start following them. And I do a wide range. My morning news includes everything from everything to be exposed to it, to be exposed to different styles, different ways to see how stories are told in different contexts as well. So it really comes up to your preference.
Yeah, that sounds good. Lori Rogers has asked, do you have suggested resources to help write to donors? I struggle with saying your donation helped us versus together, nonprofit and donor, we did this.
So you really want to, you is a big word when it comes to fundraising and even in social media. So you want to help guide them to give, make them feel good, make them feel like they're adding to it. So you can use a lot of you words and together, I know together is used a lot, but what have you achieved? Like, what are your success stories that you can show that you helped us do this? You were a part of this. It's kind of bringing in those words.
That's great. I don't think we have any other questions. And we've gotten through all of the ones that I had listed. Thank you very much, Jessica.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. That wraps up our webinar for today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Heather Pubels, along with our producer, Mary Kay. Be sure to check out our next Missio Nexus webinar and other upcoming events on the calendar, and have a great day.